So I'd like to just begin with a question to each of the panel, and maybe Sig, you can start the discussion and start by introducing yourself. But I'd like to know what's the most exciting thing you learned about legumes over the past year?
What have I learned recently? And I teach agroecology, and I have a book too, which I did not bring for signing, but on innovation systems and agroecology. And there's some copies at ECHO, if you ever want to see in their library. So I'm very happy to show the second edition if anyone wants. We can make an arrangement. So what I'm really excited about this year is soil health has become a thing. You know, when I was young, they thought I was a little bit crazy. Even in Malawi, I talked about active organic matter, and I was told that plants take up nitrogen, not carbon, not organic matter. So what was I talking about, nitrogen? So it was, and then I would try and draw these diagrams, and I just felt I was talking a lot to myself about health, soil health. They thought it was too touchy-feely. But in America, at least, and many places, soil health is now something, yes, people are passionate about. And I think that sometimes you look at legumes, and you see how quickly the leaves decompose. So the microbes eat them. So you think, oh, they're very good for nitrogen, but they're gone, right? You just see those leaves, they're just used up. They turn brown. But in fact, they're building organic matter. And I was schooled in this by a farmer in northern Malawi. He said, oh, madam, you've brought these mucuna and they're improving the soil fertility, and see, we can see the change with our own eyes. And I'm thinking, organic matter? That takes many, many years, soil analyses, it's variable, there's a large pool, you're trying to see a small change. Sorry, you can't. But I listened to him. He showed me in his hands the soil, little black specks in the soil. And I realized he was seeing with his own eyes what we often sieve out and do these complicated analyses of carbon. So he could see, because he's a careful observer. Not all farmers are. They're always at the edge of survival, many, but many are very good observers, and then he could see the improvements in soil carbon. So in fact, roots of carbon, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, roots of legumes can improve carbon. So although the leaves may decompose quickly, and of course provide nitrogen and build some soil microbial biota, but the exciting thing is we recently are now having some reflectometers and some simple ways to measure that. So if you're not quite as good observer as that farmer, you can help farmers with these handheld, like $300 equipment to try and see if there's a change in carbon. So you can test for yourself. In your area, do you have a soil type that legumes, or do you need compost too? Do you need fertilizer to build organic matter? So instead of arguing about it, you can actually test in your area. Because I do think, like most agronomists, that it depends. It depends where you are, but now we have better tools for people to test the role of legumes.
Difficult question, huh? And these, to be honest, these are things that I didn't learn from farmers, but I mean things that have really struck me in the past year. So the first one was I heard, we've been working around this whole area of looking at rhizobium inoculation, and we've got to this stage where we know that they work, but how would they ever get into the market? And I heard from a guy who runs an inoculant company, he's actually based in the UK, that he just sold $30,000 worth of rhizobium inoculants in Zambia this last year. And most of that's into the commercial sector, but it's a start, and it's the first time for him he really saw a signal that there is a commercial proposition. He sells actually mainly into Canada, the US, Brazil, Lithuania, you name it. And he actually, in Canada, has these trials where they test all inoculants each year, and he always wins, actually, is the best quality. So that was really great, because I saw that as a seed, if you like, of things changing. And he's actually, I mean, it's being sold by a farm input supplier who's now actually expanding into Tanzania and Uganda. It's a South African company, so I thought that was great. One other thing, if I may. The Ministry of Agriculture in Ghana have been asking us to double soybean production in the north. And the reason is that in the north of Ghana, FAO stat says zero soybean production. National statistics say 140,000 tons. You can't always trust what you read, But currently Ghana produces only 25% of the chicken they consume. With urbanization, the demand for the chicken is going up wildly. The country currently only uses, of the feed for the chickens that are produced, only 20% is produced nationally. There's this incredible opportunity for farmers, for smallholder farmers, to produce soybean, to sell them into national chains which can go to produce chicken in country, a massive import substitution option. And I can really see this actually now operating potentially from a policy level down and back up again. We're working then together with the Ministry of Agriculture, together with inoculant producers, together with fertilizer companies, and I have to state, for Roland's benefit, I'm not paid by any fertilizer company, but I do believe that we need fertilizers to be used. And we've got a special blend for legumes, and this all seems to be coalescing around an opportunity to actually really go for import substitution in Ghana. And I think the same is quite possible here. Actually, we've got work in the Iringa, Songea, and Njombe region around that as well in Tanzania. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling on. I'll stop.
Well, I think the most exciting thing that's happened that I've learned this last year, I learned it about 3 weeks ago. I was in Mali and we were looking for some species of Carnavalia that I knew were close to extinction. The one I was really looking for, I think, is extinct now. We couldn't find it anywhere. But in the process, we found 4 other species of Carnavalia, one of which I'm pretty excited about because, first of all, the seed is bigger than any other Carnavalia seed I've seen, and by and large, the larger a Carnavalia a seed is from the genus Carnavalia, the more drought resistant it is. And the second piece of evidence I have is that this seed is from up around Mopti, which is further north than the area where any of these other seeds come from. And of course in the Sahel, the further north you get, the drier things are. So I suspect this is probably the most drought resistant small plant legume that we know of, or certainly that we've ever used. If that's true, if it's anything like I think it probably will be, we may be able to grow green manure cover crops in areas down to, I don't know, somewhere near 200 to 250 millimeters a year of rain and bring back those soils. We'll see. But I'm pretty excited about it, and I have a couple of farmers that I know very well that are multiplying the seed right as we speak. And they're also doing some drought-resistant trials. And in 4 or 5 months, we'll probably have plenty of seed and maybe an answer to the question of whether this will expand tremendously our area of impact for green manure cover crops.
Okay, I'm called Daniel. My question goes to Madam. You talked about innovation platforms. And I would love to hear how your experience in possibly the use of the innovation platform, mostly in the issue of GMCC, maybe promotion. Yeah, I would love to know whether you have any experience on that and how it feels like. Thank you.
Okay, innovation platforms. I think there are many different animals in different places, but in Malawi there are a lot from the public sector. So extension, working with community agriculture development agencies of various sorts. And the idea in central Malawi, where we've worked for a number of years, is to keep us in communication and to be more demand-driven around technologies and innovations. So they'll have a lot of discussions where we as a research group, Africa Rising in that case, can come in and give options like pigeon pea, doubled up legumes, we'll talk about tomorrow. And then they think about where it might work in their area. So it puts us in communication with village leaders and extension. And I think that we need to pursue many ways to get more demand driven, right? We talk about talking to farmers, but those are just one place. So we have to think about ways to engage with communities at many levels. And so in different countries, you have different types of innovation platforms. I know in other places they have private industry there too, which I think we've heard examples from Ken Giller that I think are really inspirational, that we need to have people that can provide the inputs there, stockists and traders. But it also can work just from the public sector in terms of moving us forward by thinking more. We tend to get very specific, our locations, these are what is needed here. But innovation platforms get us thinking at a different level and providing options and then seeing how they go forward. So I look forward to hearing from other people and what they've done, but we found it quite very useful in central Malawi at least.
Next question here. I got a couple questions. One is if you had experience with temporary bean, particularly in the context of planting with the first rains or planting earlier than maybe you would plant with another type of bean, and also the relay cropping on the tail end, because it seems to have a pretty high drought tolerance. That's one question. Another question I have is if you've tried mixing different types of beans together as an intercrop or a green manure cover crop, like say your jack bean, if it will proliferate if it's droughty, and the lab bean may proliferate if it's less droughty.
Let's have Roland answer the temporary bean question and Sig the legume mixture question.
Okay. Now, I haven't worked with temporary beans much, but there is a bean that does a very similar thing, and that is, and also is very much more widely known, and that's the 60-day cowpea. The 60-day cowpea, in addition to cutting the hunger season by a month, because it produces beans sooner than anything else, it also, if you plant it in good moist soil after a good rain, it will assure you a harvest. I mean, it doesn't need it. If you plant it when the soil is wet, it doesn't need any more rain at all to produce beans. So farmers are doing two things with it. One is they're planting it with the first rains that come in the season, like in May, in the Sahel, and the rains will probably, that's very early, so the rains will probably stop for another month and a half or something. They get a harvest of beans within a month after they eventually plant their maize. Another thing they're doing is at the end of the rainy season, if they get a good rain or a good series of rains, they'll plant the bean and they'll get a harvest 2 months into the dry season. So the farmers themselves are finding all sorts of very interesting ways to use it. And I think it probably has many of the same characteristics as a temporary bean, except virtually everybody in Africa eats lots and lots of cowpeas.
So I am appreciating your question about legume mixtures, because we're often taught cereals and legumes go so well together, and they do. I'm going to provide some evidence tomorrow how you can improve nitrogen fixation, at least the percentage, in a legume by growing it next to a cereal. As we know, they will work together. But I think underappreciated is that legumes of different growth types can also be combined and then provide different services, right? That some, as you said, might be drought tolerant, the other less so, because it's still difficult to predict the weather. In fact, extraordinarily difficult, other than there might be some dry spells. So having a combination that will help you buffer against different weather. We've also found having 2 legumes with food, both producing food, like groundnuts as an understory with pigeon pea, and soybean under pigeon pea. It's a bit messy, but it actually will do some soil rehabilitation and provides 2 food crops. So for years and years we promoted mucuna, which doesn't do well with other things because it strangles everything. It really grows well. So some things have that strategy of just overrunning everything, but other things are, and I know ECHO and other places have, and the selections you heard about today with these bunch types obviously fit better with other plants. They're better neighbors, right? So vines are good at relays. We can put them in later. So you have to really look closely, observe how it grows, talk to farmers, and test for yourself in your area, in your soil types, what combinations, different planting times. And I think that sometimes farmers will invest, if they can't put their whole farm in Mucuna or in jack bean, they may be able to put in 2 legumes and at least give the soil a rest from continuous maize.
We had a very interesting experience. Way back in the 1980s, we realized that a lot of things, the textbooks we were getting in Latin America translated from English were leading us in wrong directions. I mean, they were telling us to get tractors and plow the soil, and of course it was damaging our soils. They'd tell us to make hay and silage, and neither of them is as nutritious as a good legume that grows all year long, and so forth and so on. I mean, it was a whole list of wrong leads. So we decided, okay, let's find out what kind of agriculture is best for the tropics. Okay? We're just going to throw away the textbooks, and we're going to find out. So we went all over Latin America, farmers that had a really good reputation, programs that had a really good reputation, so forth, asking people, okay, how do you get the best agricultural production around here? We came up with 5 rules. It took us about 12 years, but we came up with 5 rules. 3 of them are the rules of conservation agriculture. 2 others are basically just maximize biodiversity. But maximize also biomass production. Produce absolutely as much biomass as you can. And the 5th one is kind of strange and very different. It's feed the plants through the litter layer or the mulch rather than through the soil, because in so many areas of Africa the soil is really kind of a hospitable environment for roots. They do much better in the mulch. And so we promote a biodiverse mulch, not just grass, but a biodiverse mulch. And plant roots, people often say, well, now hold it. Plant roots are going to grow upward. Frankly, plant roots will grow in any direction where dinner is served. They will, if they have to grow up to get it, they will. About 6 years later, after we developed this set of rules, we were talking one day about how they all sort of worked very well together. You know, if you produce a lot of biomass and you don't plow the soil, then you're going to have a tremendous cover automatically. I mean, the rules all fit together real well. There was a synergy, as we say. All of a sudden it hit us that all our rules were doing were describing a tropical forest. You know, God doesn't go out there and till a forest every year. You know, forests always have what we call a litter layer, which is the same as a mulch, et cetera, et cetera. All we had learned really was what you got to do is imitate the forest. Well, the forest doesn't just have one legume, okay? And so what we gradually are doing is starting out, usually with farmers, we will only introduce 1 or 2 legumes at a time because you can't get things too complicated right off the bat. But then we'll start looking for another one and a third one. We also have found very definitely that by having a crawling legume, a bushy legume that can live with the crops you're growing, and a tree that can provide a light shade, which we call dispersed shade, or an intermittent shade, which is another way of handling the shade so that crops aren't affected negatively. We can have, first of all, people talk about climate smart agriculture. You've got climate smart agriculture when you got all that, because the trees are going to keep the temperature down wherever you want it. You prune them so you get the temperature you want. And the extra biomass in the soil will protect you from the irregularity of the rains, because the moisture will stay in the soil longer. So what we have found is that the more legumes we can get out there and still grow good crops and still maximize our crop productivity is the number we want. And if, you know, we've got some systems now where we've got 4 and 5 legumes. I'm hoping we'll have 6 or 8 or 10 pretty soon. So I don't think the book's been written at all yet as to how many different legumes we ought to have out there. What I do know is we need more than we have now. Thank you.
Question back here.
Yes, my question goes to Roland Banch. I'm Godfrey Magoma from Wedi Renew, Mwanza. One day I visited a farm, and when we were discussing about different GMCC, he happened to show me a Canivaria or jack bean plant, which is within the livestock field where livestock were feeding. And it was during the dry season where almost all the grasses were a bit dry. But fortunately, those Canivaria were not eaten by the livestock. So that clicked in my mind that can Canivaria be used as one of the GMCC to combat the problem of livestock sea integration? What's your experience?
Okay, we use jack beans or Carnavalia, and there are several other Carnavalias that are used very widely in Brazil, for instance. We use them precisely because they aren't affected by insects, they aren't affected very much by plant diseases, they're very resistant to all sorts of situations that for other crops would be a problem, like extremely degraded soils and drought, etc., etc. Now, if you get in an area where the animals really get hungry, this happened to us in northern Burkina Faso, so you're practically in the Sahara Desert, and the animals didn't start eating the Carnavalia until about, I think it was March or April, which is just a month or two before the rains are going to come again. The cattle finished off all the jack beans in several villages because they got so hungry. I doubt they would ever get that hungry here, but you should be aware that that is a possibility. But by and large, we use Carnavalia precisely because you can have roaming cattle in most climates and they won't touch the jack bean. I mean, that's a characteristic we're really looking forward to. Now, another thing I just discovered 2 weeks ago, and I don't know why we didn't think about this earlier, and I don't know why the farmers didn't think about it, but there are some species of green manure cover crops, especially for particularly droughty areas. I mean, we're talking about areas that have less than 500 millimeters of rain a year. Two of them are the Gliricidia tree, and another one is a native of Africa, probably the best green manure that's a native of Africa that I know of, called Peliostigma. Peliostigma reticulata is the one people usually use. Both of these, we now have a way of growing in areas where cattle are around. The Gliricidia has the problem that it's short enough the first dry season that the cattle can kill it. But what you can do is farmers all over the Sahel and also in southern Africa, etc., build temporary fences quite frequently to grow their vegetables. There's all sorts of ways they do it, but you know, piling up thorny bushes and stuff like that. And those will keep the cattle out usually for 6 months to a year. So what you can do is you can plant your Gliricidia and your Peliostigma. The Peliostigma, by the way, gets attacked by animals the first year, but after that they won't touch it. It doesn't taste good. So what you can do is you can plant your Peliostigma and your Gliricidia. The Gliricidia you can actually make permanent live fences. So if people want permanent live fences around a piece of land, they can plant that inside the temporary shelter. The temporary shelter will get them through the first dry season. By the second dry season, the Gliricidia is too tall and the Peliostigma is too bitter for the animals to bother, and so you've got green manures. And you know, if you don't make a permanent Peliostigma fence, the animals are going to be wandering in there, you know, for the next 40 years. But the Peliostigma and the Gliricidia will also be producing lots of biomass and other things that farmers need for 40 years. So that's not even in the second edition of Restoring the Soil, because I just learned that a few weeks ago.
Peliostigma is a legume, but it's not a nitrogen-fixing legume. It's in the sessile penioides, so it can't actually form nodules and fix nitrogen. Yeah? Its old name was Bauhinia. It's they call it the monkey breadfruit down here. That has big pods that they feed the livestock as well. But I mean, it's used. I mean, I know a lot of researchers are talking about using it in the Sahel for soil fertility improvement. I just want to make the point: it's not fixing nitrogen, for what it's worth. What I'd like to draw attention to as well, Roland, is what I love to listen to as you're talking is you're talking about different legumes in different places and adaptation and really adapting the systems to the local conditions, yeah? And when I'm talking about legumes in general and farming systems, I like very much to use this analogy of the square peg and the round hole, yeah? So we need to find a square hole for the square peg, and that square hole has to be the right size, yeah? I mean, it's not just a matter of getting something and hammering it until it gets in there, yeah? So, I mean, the idea of tailoring technologies to local conditions, I think is really what I believe very much is the way we have to go. And for me, that actually says that we have to be very careful about not getting too dogmatic about approaches. And what I listen to you saying is a very much a nuanced approach of different things for different places. But then sometimes things like your principles of the rainforest, I can understand that in humid climates, but I don't really see that works particularly well in the dry parts of the Sahel and so on. And so, I mean, I think we have to be careful of not pushing things beyond the boundaries within which they work, and very much looking for adapting knowledge, the best of our knowledge, to the local situation, yeah? So it's a bit of a disagreement, but largely an agreement.
My name is Raymond, working with World Renew Uganda. I have two questions, and the first one is, of the legumes that we've been talking about, is there one that we know or we can recommend in terms of the amount of nitrogen that that particular legume leaves in the soil for the next season? Because it fixes the nitrogen, it's also using that. So do we have, let's say, a particular one that will fix, use, but leave more in the soil for the next crop? The second question is, out of the experiences that you have had, are there some things that you think we, as people who are working with the farmers, we can start looking at? Because those could be things or issues that may make a greater impact as we go forward.
Now, if I understood your question, you're asking if there's a legume that will fix a lot more nitrogen than it needs for itself and will provide nitrogen for the next crop. Almost all of them, the ones that we use, yeah. Now, granted, there are some legumes that have been mentioned here that we don't use. For instance, groundnuts, we don't use as a green manure. Now, I fully agree with Sieg about the value of having a doubled-up legume system that includes groundnuts, because people have more to eat. But by and large, one of the biggest problems with green manure cover crops, and I didn't have a chance this morning to talk about the problems. There are several problems. They're well explained in my book. Probably the most difficult problem with green manure cover crops is to have any fertility for the following season. You have to have, and this is a sort of a rule of thumb, you have to have green leaves, green leguminous leaves, on the ground when your next crop is planted. That means, for instance, groundnuts, they die at the end of the wet season. They spend the whole dry season there in the field, and they lose virtually all their nitrogen to volatilization. And an awful lot of the biomass is lost too, to just sort of burning and rotting. So, and this is true of many legumes that, frankly, scientists have tested to see if they were any good as green manures, and they weren't. That's true of cowpeas, the normal cowpeas, either 60-day or 90-day cowpeas. It's true of green grams. It's true of rice beans. It's true of all sorts of different beans that only last for 3 or 4 months. And then they die, and they sit there during the whole dry season, and they lose virtually every bit of the nitrogen they had. Okay, they won't help future crops unless you find some special way to. But mucuna's in the same bag, except in areas where you have very, very high rainfall. Then it completely changes the thing around. And we have an extremely successful mucuna system in 3 or 4 countries of Central America and Mexico. But the ones we've been talking about here are precisely ones that will grow through the dry season and provide green leaves the next year. The pigeon pea, the Gliricidia, the Pediostigma, quite a number of different legumes, and of the edible ones, Lab, of course, is probably number one. Very edible. It will grow clear through a 6-month dry season, even if you don't have a bipolar system like rain system like here in Tanzania and Kenya. It'll go right through 6 months of dry season and still have lots of green leaves and even beans to eat when the rains start the following year.
There was a question earlier which was about why do you call them green manures when they're often not green? Well, I mean, I like to talk about grain legumes because they're basically crops that people grow for their grain. And those crops are harvested, and often with groundnut, they're pulled out of the ground. I mean, you see the same with beans. I mean, the people harvest the whole tops, they take them away, they shell them elsewhere. That definitely means they don't leave anything like the soil fertility benefit that you would get with a green manure, because green manures are largely grown to be left in the soil. But you do get a soil fertility benefit from them. And we've seen that, and we did an analysis of all the papers and things we could find, and that analysis would indicate that it's worth about half a ton of maize in the next season, just growing a legume in rotation, harvesting it, and taking it away. It's not going to build the soil in the way that Roland's talking about, but legumes do have a benefit in terms of putting something back. And of course that benefit's not just nitrogen, it's also related to the fact that they give you a break in terms of pests and diseases. I'd say for groundnuts, actually for groundnuts, cowpea, for most of these, we've measured 250, 300 kilograms of nitrogen fix, same in soybeans, some of the leafier soybean varieties. But a lot of that's taken away at harvest. But a lot of it falls in leaf, say with soybean. By the time you take a soybean away, it's just a dry stem. But a lot of that leaf has actually gone into the soil. So they do have some benefit, it's not as much. There's a bit of disagreement here, maybe, I'm not sure.
And I've always tried to take sort of an in-between role. Yeah, by the way, they forced me to sit here. I'm going to sit over there, but anyway. So I've always believed in sort of what I call semi-perennials or multi-pulses, things that give something for the soil, something for farmers to eat, and I think that some of the shrubs and vines that live a long time, I think we all like the long duration. Cowpea we heard about, pigeon pea, if you knew me, you knew I was going to get there, and various ones that give this kind of, that you can even be ratooned and regrow. So the perenniality, I mean, a lot of people have been talking recently about maybe we could get maize to fix nitrogen, and it's kind of nonsense because yes, we could, but it probably wouldn't be very much because legumes are very fine-tuned at producing, being able to fix nitrogen. As you heard, even soybean and groundnuts, 200 kgs. But we have to think about, if you want something left for the soil, you're going to probably have to have a crop that produces some food, but most of it is a lot of vegetation and roots. So these in-between plants have a very special role, these shrubs. And the sad thing is sometimes we've bred them to become shorter statured, and there's nothing wrong with being short. I think it has certain advantages. But it also means that you don't have much of the copious vegetation. Wasn't that funny? I know, I always get one short joke in. So, because hybrids are short statured and highly productive. So, I think that we need to be producing things that, and this is where I think we very much agree with Roland here, biomass. I'm really about copious amounts of medium quality biomass. And it doesn't matter how much something fixes. If you want it left in the soil, you need this kind of medium, so things that are shrubs and vines have been overlooked and are even being made into something that's a great crop but not good for the soil. There are some trade-offs, but I think we can have some bridges too.
Well, I'm going to disagree with Ken here. Maximizing biomass is a rule that works absolutely, in fact, is probably more important in the Sahel than it is in the humid tropics. Because, among other things, as many people here have said, one of the biggest criticisms of green manures in the Sahel is, well, now hold it, if you're going to put all this stuff in the soil, what happens to the animals? In other words, you need to be able to produce as much biomass as you can so you can feed your animals and feed the soil. And that requires quite a bit of biomass, you know. So I haven't seen anything yet in the last 20 years that has made me feel that the principle of you know, copying a tropical forest doesn't work in the dryland areas. Also, in terms of definitions of terminology, the term green manure cover crops was developed at a meeting I was at in Central America about 35 years ago. And the people there that were present there who developed that, I didn't develop the term, they did. They feel that since they developed the term and they developed the concept, they have a right to define it the way they want to. And some people say, well, but grain legumes are grain legumes, and so they can't be green manure cover crops. But most of the terminology in agriculture is overlapping. For instance, a lab will grow into a lab plant will actually grow into a tree. I've seen lab trees with wooden stems this big in Haiti. So now is lab a grain legume? Well, some people would say yes. But hold it, it's an agroforestry species. It's a tree. So are we going to say it can't be a grain legume if it's a you know, I mean, there are all sorts of categories in agriculture that overlap. Some of the same plants are used with different missions involved. And so we don't have any problem. Grain legumes are one form of green manure cover crop. Fertilizer trees, some people say that's a different thing. As far as we're concerned, fertilizer trees are also included in green manure cover crops. And since we developed the definition, I think we have a right to be able to include what the definition should include. Thank you.
We've got time for one more question.
Oh,
One, can you pass to someone who hasn't?
hasn't asked, yeah. Okay.
There's a woman in the front. We haven't had a woman ask a question yet. Better be a good question.
No close-ups, please. Anyway, it's very interesting for me, who is quite new to permaculture. I've been in permaculture for about 4 or 5 years, and started to do some projects in France, in Kenya, and India, and here. And I'm wondering one thing when you're talking about soy. What? Okay. I'm wondering, because you're talking so much about soybeans, soya, and maize and beans, and that farmers should be eating this. I am Swedish. Many years ago, we didn't know about salads and olive oil and lemons and stuff like that. Wouldn't it be interesting if even farmers had a change of nutrition that would be feeding them better? And so we could stop calling farmers the poor farmers. Because, my God, they are really doing such a fantastic job. So my question is it, do you consider soybeans, maize, and beans a good basic food? And should it be like that for many hundred years? Could it change? Is there other possibilities to develop the eating habits even here in Africa? Yeah, I mean, because it seems so limited to me. Thank you.
I mean, I think maize and beans is a great diet, actually. I don't think it's for us to prescribe anything, to be honest. And I mean, I think there are all sorts of initiatives looking at a whole variety of different crops. I mean, we tend to be a bit dominated here by legumes. That happens to be the 3 people sitting in front of you, I think, more than anything. I mean, I think that yeah, well, if you mention soybean, I mean, soybean actually is very little consumed in Africa directly. It nearly all is used as a feed, and it's going into the feed industry largely for poultry. It does have advantages where you have village feeding programs, particularly for children, because it has some essential amino acids that other legumes don't have. But yeah, I mean, I used to work in Zimbabwe, where you see 80–90% of the land area is under maize, and all I want to do is diversify that. But of course, farmers carry on growing maize because they know that they can eat it, and if they can't eat that, they can always sell it, even when markets are dysfunctional. So, I mean, there are some good reasons for why farmers do what they do, and it's really up to them to decide in the end.
Actually, between us and us in Central America, when I was there, still there, and the Brazilians, were using over 100 different species of legumes. I have never counted exactly how many, but probably 40 or 50 of those are edible. And we have all sorts of different kinds of beans that the people in the United States or Sweden would not know about. Green grams, cowpeas, soybeans, fava beans, scarlet runner beans, beans that, beans you've never heard of. And also, if we're maximizing the biodiversity in our fields, we aren't just growing maize. In fact, one of the things that happens almost inevitably when farmers improve their soils and get them, so they're producing, say, 3 tons or 4 tons of maize per hectare, they start diversifying. They start producing vegetables because they can produce high quality vegetables that will be acceptable and have a good price in almost any market. For instance, I went back to one area where I worked in Guatemala in the 1970s. When I was first there, there were about 15 different species between fruits, vegetables, grains, so forth, that people sold in the local market that they had produced in that township. About 15 species, maybe a couple more or something like that. There are also some herbs, etc. I went back about 5 years ago. The program lasted for 10 years, so 5 years ago it had been out of business for at least 35, 40 years. And I counted in the local market, I counted 94 different species that people were producing locally of vegetables, fruits, herbs, all sorts of stuff. So we're not talking about limiting people's diets by any stretch of the imagination.
But that was in South America.
That was in Central America, yes, in the country of Guatemala. Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a good illustration of the fact that even if we have 3 people who are experts in their field, there can be disagreement. We still have lots to learn from each other. We have lots to learn from the environments where we work, and together we will be much wiser than we will be as individuals. So thank you again, and thanks for all the good questions and discussions.